Empey assured him that everyone was doing just fine and mentioned that she had brought a large collection of photographs to share. She then asked if Gomer might have some free time. She suggested they could go into town together, enjoy a nice dinner, and have a long, unhurried talk. A shadow of regret crossed Gomer's face. He explained that he truly wished he could, but all the other fellows were out on pass, and he had been assigned the barracks duty for the day. Aunt B, never one to let a minor obstacle ruin a plan, immediately suggested that she could accompany him back to his quarters. They could easily visit and catch up while he completed his tasks. Gomer hesitated for a brief moment, considering the military rules, but decided that since it was Sunday and the building was practically empty, there would not be any harm in it. He agreed, and Ampy clapped her hands in delight, once again remarking on how handsome her young friend had become. They walked side by side down the quiet base roads until they reached Gomer's barracks. As they stepped inside the large, open room lined with perfectly made beds and metal footlockers, Ampy looked around with keen interest. Gomer proudly pointed out his specific living area, indicating his bunk and the locker right next to it. Ampy looked surprised. She asked if that small space was truly all the room he had. She had assumed that, after being in the service for a while, he would have earned a private room of his own. Gomer chuckled politely, explaining that a soldier had to rank significantly higher than a private first class to secure such accommodations. Ampy clicked her tongue sympathetically, noting the complete lack of privacy. Gomer agreed, but quickly highlighted the positive side, explaining that it was a very friendly environment. He admitted that it had been difficult to adjust to sharing a sleeping quarter with so many other men at first. However, he had grown so accustomed to the camaraderie that he doubted he could ever sleep in a solitary room again. Ampy smiled softly, acknowledging that human beings had a remarkable ability to adapt to almost anything. She then inquired about the specific duties he needed to perform. Gomer listed his chores with cheerful diligence. He needed to mop the floor, dust the tops of the lockers, wash the windows, and generally spruce the place up for the coming week. Ampy was taken aback. She pointed out that he was describing household chores. Gomer agreed, admitting that one could certainly call it housework. She asked if he was expected to clean the massive room all by himself. Gomer explained that normally all the men shared the responsibility, cleaning their own respective areas. But since they were all out enjoying their leave, and he had no other plans, he had decided to do it for them. Aunt B was astonished to learn that the young men of the military had to perform their own domestic labor on top of all their intense physical drilling and marching. Gomer assured her it was simply part of being a Marine. When she asked how long this practice had been in place, Gomer guessed it had been a tradition for about 200 years. Shaking her head in disbelief, Ampy declared that one would think the government could spare a few extra dollars to hire a maid for the boys. Gomer laughed good-naturedly. He invited her to sit down on his neatly made bunk so they could visit while he began to mop the floor. Ampy stood her ground, her maternal instincts fully awakened. She flatly refused to sit idly by while someone else did housework. She commanded Gomer to find her a jacket or a sweater to protect her dress, something to cover her hair, and to hand her a mop. Gomer protested weakly, insisting that she could not possibly help him clean a military barracks. But Ampy would not hear of it. She told him not to argue and to simply do as she said. Reluctantly, Gomer found some spare gear to protect her clothing. As Ampy took the mop, she continued to express her bewilderment. She marveled at the fact that millions of dollars were collected in taxes, yet the military would not allocate a small sum for a professional cleaner. She mentioned that a lady named Mavis Pearlback in Mayberry would gladly come in on a Thursday and clean the entire place perfectly for a mere $8. Gomer tried to explain that it was not a matter of money, but rather an essential part of building discipline and character in a Marine. Ampy remained unconvinced, firmly believing that having a woman come in just once or twice a week would make a world of difference. She pointed out that the bare windows could desperately use some curtains, and the stark walls would benefit from a few tasteful pictures. Gomer noted that some of the men did keep pictures, but they were strictly kept on the inside doors of their lockers. Aunt Bee astutely deduced that those were not exactly the type of pictures she had in mind. Shifting her attention, she noticed Gomer struggling with the glass panes. She gently but firmly criticized his technique, asking what type of cleaning solution he was using. Gomer replied that it was just the standard issue window cleaner provided by the military. Aunt Bee shook her head, sharing her tried and true domestic secret. What he really needed, she explained, was white vinegar mixed with a little water. Gomer admitted he did not have any vinegar on hand, but suggested he might be able to acquire some from the mess hall cooks. Aunt Bee encouraged him to go immediately, stating her philosophy that if a job was worth doing, it was worth doing correctly. Despite his hesitation to leave her alone, Gomer relented and hurried off to fetch the vinegar, leaving Aunt Bee to happily scrub the barracks floor. It was at this precise moment that the formidable Sergeant Carter entered the barracks, expecting to find an empty room save for his diligent subordinate. He instead discovered a civilian woman energetically mopping the floor. Sergeant Carter stopped dead in his tracks. He called out a cautious greeting. Aunt Bee, deeply focused on her task, barely looked up. She immediately scolded him for walking on her freshly cleaned floor, warning him that he was tracking dirt over the wet surface. Sergeant Carter blinked, completely thrown off balance. He demanded to know who she was. Aunt Bee introduced herself as Miss Taylor and calmly asked him for his identity. He puffed up his chest and announced that he was Sergeant Carter. He then demanded to know exactly what she was doing in his barracks. Aunt Bee, stating the obvious, replied that she was mopping the floor. Carter clarified his question, asking why she was present in a restricted military building. She cheerfully explained that she was a dear friend of Private First Class Gomer-Pyle and was simply helping him out with his chores. Carter was aghast. The very idea of a civilian, let alone a motherly woman, performing duties in his barracks was a direct violation of countless regulations. He tried to explain this to her, his voice rising in frustration, but Aunt Bee was more concerned with the footprints he was leaving on her pristine floor. She treated him not as a terrifying drill instructor, but as a rude neighbor who had forgotten to wipe his shoes. Just as the situation was escalating, Gomer returned, triumphantly holding a bottle of vinegar. He greeted his sergeant enthusiastically, completely oblivious of the tension in the room. He proudly introduced Aunt Bee, mentioning that he had written volumes about his beloved sergeant in his letters back home. Aunt Bee looked at Sergeant Carter critically. She remarked that she had pictured him being quite a bit taller. Gomer quickly defended his sergeant, stating that while he might not be tall, he was as solid as a rock. Sergeant Carter, trying desperately to maintain his military bearing, addressed Aunt Bee. He explained that Private Pyle had clearly failed to inform her of the strict base regulations. Civilians were strictly forbidden inside the barracks, and he had no choice but to ask her to leave immediately. Aunt Bee looked genuinely disappointed. She explained that she had traveled a long way just to visit with Gomer. Carter expressed his regrets but stood firm, stating that rules were rules. He directed her to the recreation room at the end of the street, warning her that it might be a long wait since Gomer had a great deal of punishment work ahead of him. Aunt Bee surrendered her borrowed jacket and cap, her heart heavy with concern. She promised Gomer she would wait for him, hoping it would not take too long. Gomer promised to finish as quickly as possible. As she walked toward the door, she cast one final, stern glance at Sergeant Carter, admonishing him to be careful of the clean sections of the floor. The moment the door closed behind her, Sergeant Carter unleashed his fury on Gomer. He listed the multiple infractions Gomer had committed. First, having a civilian in the barracks. Second, having a female civilian in the barracks. Third, allowing a civilian to wear pieces of a United States Marine uniform. Carter shouted, questioning how Gomer could still be making such monumental mistakes after 3 years in the service. He demanded to know what it would take to get through Gomer's thick skull. Suddenly,